Good evening, everyone. My name is Emma Koss. For those of you who don't know me, I'm one of the owners here at the Norwich Bookstore. If you've been to an event before, you've probably seen my husband present. He's much better at it than I am, but sadly he could not be here tonight, so you are the left with the lesser half. But welcome. Very excited to have you joining us here today for our event with Lee McColgan, A House Restored. If that's not the event you were expecting to come to, I recommend you stay anyway because it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Before we get to Lee, I would just like to remind everyone to turn off your cell phones, any devices that might make noise, so we can have a nice quiet set. We are filming tonight thanks to our friends at Junction Arts Media. This will be viewable after the fact for all to enjoy. If you like our events here at the Norwich Bookstore, I recommend you sign up for our email newsletter. We do about 100 events a year, both on-site and off-site. Best way to find out about those is by subscribing to our newsletter, following us on social media. The best way to ensure that we can continue to do such events is to buy a book or two. This one makes a great gift. I've read it. It's incredible. Buying books, it's what we do here, keeps the lights on, keeps us getting great authors like Lee to come to the store. So if you enjoy the event, afterwards you can see us at the front counter, buy a copy of the book, have Lee sign it, send one to all your friends. Lee McColgan, who we are so excited to have here, has worked on Boston's Old North Church, Louisa May Alcott's Orchard House, which is my favorite part of his bio, and other buildings. His work has appeared in Architectural Digest, the Boston Globe, and the Wall Street Journal. He currently lives with his wife in the Loring House in Pembroke, Massachusetts. Before we get to Lee McColgan, I'm very excited to invite up Sarah Rooker, the director of the Norwich Historical Society. We're huge fans here of the Norwich Historical Society. It's right over there. We're neighbors. Sarah and the Norwich Historical Society have been wonderful in helping us co-promote this event. Sarah, if you wouldn't mind joining me up here to chat with folks about the pamphlets you brought and the other cool things that the Historical Society does. Thanks. Gonna give you the mic.
It's fun to be here tonight. I really enjoyed reading The House Restored, and I brought with me some pamphlets on how to research your old house. If you're interested in learning more about it, there's some tips on here and some links, and you can take that with you. And I love researching old houses. I can go down the rabbit's warren of deeds and probate records and really dig into the history of the architecture here in this town. And the stories and the architecture are just wonderful. But what I really loved about this book was that Lee actually went and learned how to learn the trades that were needed to build a house. So blacksmithing and carpentry and window glazing and all sorts of trades. And it made me think about the houses a little bit more, and it made me think more about the houses in this town and the people who actually built them. And the Historical Society has this L full of tools. And every time I look at them, I think, oh, these rusty tools, what am I going to do with all these? How am I going to store them? I don't even know what they really are. And after reading this book, I realized that there was true tinkering abilities, ingenious abilities, and mechanical abilities in this town. And the tools are just a testimony to what people knew how to do here. And when we look at all these old houses in the town, think about that too. Not just the people who lived in them, but the work that went into hewing those beams and making that plaster and figuring out how to put in those windows and all of that they couldn't just call someone to do. And it brings the houses, it just brings that much more of a rich cultural landscape that we are living here with in this town. So it's a great book for helping to think about your homes in that way as well. So thank you, Lee, for writing it. It's been fun to look at. And you can pick up one of these after the program.
Am I on?
Your turn.
My turn. Let's talk about old houses, people. Wow. All right. Yes, old houses. Yes, old houses have drawn a pretty good crowd here. That's not bad. Before I get into any of this, I do have to say it's great to be back in Vermont. So while I live in Massachusetts and Pembroke, Massachusetts is getting some of the credit, a lot of my life was in Rutland, Vermont. So I moved there when I was 10. I went to Johnson State College, which is not a college anymore. It's still another university, but my alma mater is gone, but that's okay. And I served in 2004 with the 1st 86th Field Artillery out of Berlin. We did the first deployment of the National Guard to Iraq first deployment that had been done in a long, long time. So I love Vermont. So Vermont is very much a part of my story, so it's good to be here. All right, to the book. Enough of Vermont, you guys get it. To the book. So I'll do 3 things. I'll try to do them briefly. I may go on a tangent. If you have questions, just shout them out. It doesn't have to be that formal. I'm a pretty informal character, as you can probably tell already. So I'll start with, why did I write this book? I'll talk a little bit about what the story is without giving too much away, just an overview. And then I'll tell you one story from the book, and then I'll take questions. And if you have questions about your own they don't have to be about my story. If you live in an old house and have questions about your own old house, which is what most people come up to me afterwards with, I am more than glad to take a stab at whatever mess that you've gotten yourself into, because as you'll find out, I got myself into a big one, so I get it. All right, so why did I write this book? So I guess the suit gives it away. When you see the pictures in the book, it's like, wow, he looked cleaned up when he was here. As a preservationist, I'm usually a dirty mess. But this is a giveaway to a previous career I had. So the book's part memoir, part history. I actually worked in finance for a number of years. And I left finance to get into historic preservation. And I should ask, do any finance people here? This doesn't look, we got one. Okay, don't take this personally. Generally, when you tell people you work in finance, it's not philanthropy, you're not saving lives. People don't get super excited. You sell mutual funds? That's amazing. And I'm fine with that. When I left that world, though, and got into historic preservation, saving old buildings, especially in New England, I thought the reaction would be somewhat different. I thought that everyone, everywhere I went, would be excited about saving old buildings. Of course, this is what gives our towns the quaint character that we love. I thought everybody would get this. And very quickly, what did I find out? Does everybody care about saving old buildings? No, they do not.
They want to rip them down.
Yes, you realize saving every darn old building is a fight. You're battling developers. Some people could care less. So for those of us that appreciate that quaint character that they bring and what went into building them, we get frustrated when they get torn down. So I am a fan of regulation. In the town that I live in now, the best thing we can do, and I don't know what the rules here are, is put a 1-year moratorium on a property. If someone wants to tear it down, doesn't matter the age. Could be 17th century, could be 1600s. 1-year moratorium. Someone buys it, generally for the lot. They want to bulldoze it. We put 1-year moratorium on it. They have to wait a year, and then what do? Rip it down. They bulldoze it. And what have we done in that process? We have just pissed them off because now they had to wait a year. So I am in favor of regulation. Many of you are probably, I'm assuming I'm preaching to the choir, probably my camp. But I understand, I do see the other side of it. When someone spends a lot of their own hard-earned money to buy a property, they don't want to be told what they can or cannot do with it. And this, unfortunately, sometimes pits the historic societies. I was on the board of our historic society, the historic commissions, the groups that think that this is good for saving the character of these towns, against the very townspeople that we are serving. And it can get prickly, and I've been to many a contentious town hall meeting, and I've seen both sides of this, and I get that. So I said there's a couple ways I can go. I could go the political angle, and maybe I can figure out how to put better regulations on the books, or I can do what I think I've been better served to do, knowing what I know about people. People like a good story. So I will tell a good preservation story. The hope is that it'll create some awareness. Maybe there will be a little more appreciation for what goes into these buildings, my own philosophical rants on why I think it matters, a little bit of history, and that is what culminated in this story. So, I've said already, the story is part memoir, it's part history. Here's the overview. My wife and I, about 7-8 years ago, bought a house that was built in 1702. I always say that the previous owner was she's not with us anymore, God rest her soul, but I always say Lydia was a wonderful, wonderful preservationist, by which I mean what? In 40 years of owning this house, she did nothing to it. Now that was part of the reason we bought it. I didn't want something gutted. I wanted all the original building fabric there. But of course that led to lots and lots of work that had to be done because this thing had not been touched. So I'm figuring out how I'm going to tackle this. One night my wife sits down, we're sitting down at dinner, we're talking about whatever, plans, building plans, and she says, I've got this great idea. She always wanted to buy a big house to host family gatherings, to bring people together under our roof. And she said, why don't we host next year's Thanksgiving at the house? This gives me 18 months to get this thing in somewhat respectable order before there will be 24 people on my doorstep. What do I say to this suggestion? Do I say, no, I can't do 18 months? Of course not. Or do I say 18 months? No problem. What could go wrong? I go with the latter option. Is this a good idea? No, this is not a good idea. So, I should stop here and ask, who lives in an old house? Where am I old? Oh, we got all right, this is good. This is good. You'd be surprised. I do these talks and sometimes no hands go up for that. Yeah. They just want to live vicariously through me. Okay. Who actually does, who's the DIYers? Who does work themselves? All right. Oh, this is good. You know my pain. All right. So as you know, or even if you don't have an old house, as anyone that's done a project knows, when you get into a house project, there are many different ways to do this. You can hire it out. You can call somebody. I don't know how it is around here, but my experience, I've been on both sides of this, by the way, but calling contractors, you call 10, you're lucky if a handful call you back. Of those, you're lucky if anyone shows up on the doorstep. You're lucky if someone starts work that they finish it all the way through in a timely fashion. I used to get really frustrated until I became a contractor, and then I've been on the other side and we're like, oh yeah, I get why they do this. You're juggling a million things. But that can be frustrating. Then there's the question of how are we going to do the work? Or we do it ourselves? Do we just watch the YouTube videos? What materials do we use? Do we just go down to the Bookstore or the hardware store and buy stuff and get some tools and get into it? Lots of different ways that we can get into this. So I was trying to figure that out. And of course the big thing is I've got this house that's come down through the ages, over 300 years, been largely untouched. I don't want to lose that character because that's what I think makes the house special. So I'm trying to preserve that. So in doing my research, I come across a book. Has anyone written anything by Nathaniel Philbrick? Do you know who that is? Oh, yeah. Yeah. So he's in Nantucket. More people in Massachusetts are generally familiar with him. But he wrote a book called In the Heart of the Sea, won a National Book Award. Ron Howard made a movie out of it. He's doing all right for himself. Before any of that success, he wrote a sleepy book that probably didn't sell that many copies called Away Offshore. It was a local history about Nantucket and its people. And I like that stuff, and I was just thumbing through it. And I came across this account of an 18th century builder named Richard Macy. And when Richard Macy wanted to build a house, he did everything. So if he needed stones for the foundation, he would go to the common ground and he would gather them up and bring them to the site. If he needed trees, he would fell them on the island and hew round logs into square beams. If they did not have timber of the right dimensions, he would get in a boat, go off the island, cut down trees on the mainland, bring them back. If he needed plaster or mortar, he would collect seashells on the beach and burn them in what's called a lime rick, converting calcium carbonate into nice white creamy putty that we can use for plaster and mortar. If he needed hardware, he would rot it with his own hands, was a blacksmith too. Pretty impressive guy, this Richard Macy. And he's doing all this before we have electricity in the pre-industrial age. And I read this account, very impressed by this. Listen, a lot of discussion about, I am not in the book banning camp. Just saw Florida's banning Stephen King books and he's posting about it. I'm not a fan of that, but I will say, books can give you dangerous, dangerous ideas. They're full of ideas and some of them are bad ideas, it's true. So I read this account, and I'm thinking about what I'm going to do with my property, and what is the idea that comes from this?
Become a blacksmith.
Become all of it. I will be Richard Macy. I will do all the repairs myself. I will do them using the traditional tools and techniques, and that is going to be the best way to preserve that character. Is this another good idea?
No.
Terrible idea. On an 18-month timeline. All right, so that's the story. So I'm going to tell you one story from this, and then I'll stop yapping and take questions. It is a little bit of a long story, so bear with me. All right, so I've got my plan. Where do I start? So I decide to start. So the house is a Georgian colonial, two-end chimney, central passageway. There's an L off the back, built in the early 1800s. There's a modern addition off the back of that. It's a big, massive thing. The L has been, this is the only thing that's been really, a lot has been done to. It's covered wall-to-wall paneling. And no offense, if anyone likes that brown veneer paneling that we loved in the... Does anyone like the brown veneer paneling that we seem to love in the 1970s for some reason? Because we put it everywhere. So this room was one of those places, layers and layers of tacky linoleum flooring and tons of this brown paneling. Now it's a timber frame structure. So everyone familiar with timber framing? Okay. Well, I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that, but I'm glad to know we're in the same ballpark. So the frame is exposed, right? And the paneling is in between the large beams. There's one very dubious corner where the paneling has also crept out and wrapped itself around one of the beams. This guy already knows. Like, that's trouble. I did not know how much trouble that was going to be. So I decided to start in that corner. Who has torn off this paneling before? This brown veneer paneling. Have we all had a crack at this stuff? All right. So as you know, this is what you do. You get a big crowbar, and that stuff will just break up into pieces if you're too rough with this. You want to be gentle. So you take the feathered end of the crowbar, and you find a seam in the panel, and you wedge it in there, and you just start working it up and down. So you want to get it off on a nice clean sheet. So I got the crowbar in there, and I'm working this, I'm in the corner, and I'm working this thing, and it's popping and it's cracking, and the dust is coming up, and the nails are wiggling, and this thing's wiggling, and I'm excited, because isn't the beginning of any project the most exciting part? Because there are so many possibilities. What could be under this paneling? Exactly. Is there going to be early cool horsehair plaster? Maybe. Maybe. There's some vintage, or not even vintage, how about Victorian era, some really old, well-preserved wallpaper under there. Oh, wouldn't that be cool? Who said it? I always have that thought. I'm like, maybe some pilgrim put a bunch of gold coins in a sack, stuffed them in the wall, forgot to tell his kids, died, and they're still in there. I had that same thought. What could I find? The possibilities are endless. So I'm prying, it's wiggling, the whole thing, and it pops off. And do I find any of that stuff? No. Of course not. Never works that way. If I found the gold coins, I probably wouldn't even be here right now. What did I find?
Mouse skeletons.
Nothing! I found a hole in the frame where a timber frame should be. Gaping hole. All right. We got some timber framers in here. And before I get there, I should say, this was alarming. And I'm looking at this and I'm wondering, how is this thing not coming down on my very head? This is true, I throw the crowbar down, clangs on the floor, run out to the barn, rummaging through a pile of wood, grab a couple 4x4s, run back in with a saw, and I'm propping stuff under there, wondering, how the heck am I not getting crushed? The answer is that those vertical sheathing boards, boy, they're a lot more structural than you would think. Turns out the whole corner of your frame can be rotten. All right, so back to the timber framing. So the corner of a timber frame, picture late 17th, 18th century, early 19th century. If it's English built, what do they call that?
Post.
More specific, the whole corner assembly. Anyone know? Ooh, we are going to learn some things tonight. All right, I'm glad. I saw a bunch of hands go up with the timber framing. I said, oh, they already know all this stuff. I'm terrified to speak in front of the Timber Framers Guild people because some of those people know more than I do. Okay, architectural historians call it the English tying joint. So it's made up of 4 elements. So you've got a big post, and it's those posts that are meaty at the top and they taper down. What do they call those? Everyone knows that one. What? Gunstock post. Who said it? Yes. So they call them gunstock posts because it looks like a gunstock got stuck in the ground. English call it a jowl post because it's got a big cheek. So you've got a gunstock post in the corner, the beam that runs along the eave end is called the wall plate. You've got the beam that runs along the gable end is called the tie beam. It ties the 2 ends of the walls together. And you have running from the ridge down a rafter, and all of this is connected with mortise and tenon joinery. Are we familiar with this? You got a woodworking shirt on. Are you a woodworker?
Yeah.
You know mortise.
Furniture size.
Okay, yeah. Well, same idea. So mortise and tenon. Everyone familiar with mortise and tenon joinery? Okay. So it's like I would say it's like a plug in a socket. So the tenon is the prong in the plug, and the mortise is the slot in the socket, and they plug together, drill a hole through it, hammer a big peg through it, and the thing will stand without nails. So that's timber framing. So I'm looking at my English tying joint, and I'm staring where all of that should be. And so, by the way, the reason that extra material is on the top of that post is because there's a tenon for each of those 2 beams, the wall plate and the tie beam, and they run perpendicular. So you need extra material for 2 of these tenons. It all sits on top of that. And oh, by the way, under the tie beam is a little dovetail, and there's a recess cut in the wall plate. It all locks together. I say it's like Lincoln logs. Remember we do Lincoln logs as a kid? So it all locks together. So it's probably the most intricate part of the joinery that you're going to find in a house of this period. And I will say, when you're looking at the most intricate part of the joinery, in a house of this period, and there is nothing but a gaping hole, and you want to do all this yourself, and you mostly have just tinkered and read stuff in books, it can be a little intimidating. So I'm thinking, maybe following the footsteps of this Richard Macy guy, maybe I need to dial that back just a smidge, not all the way, just dial that back a little bit. Maybe I need to get some help. So, there's a question, which in Vermont probably wouldn't be a problem at all. For me at this time, I'm thinking, where do I find a modern-day timber framer? There must be, everyone know how to find a timber framer around here? They're all up here, and yeah, all right. Well, down in Massachusetts, I didn't know. But I remembered going to a museum as a kid down in Plymouth. And most people, has everyone been to Plymouth, Massachusetts before? All right. What is Plymouth most well known for?
A rock.
The Pilgrims, the Rock. So who has seen the Rock?
Oh, yeah.
We get in our car, we hear about the America's founding Pilgrim story, the whole thing, Thanksgiving, all that. We drive down to Plymouth, Massachusetts. We go there to see the Rock. This is where we should be checking our heads to begin with, because we're driving a long way to see a rock. We get there, we look down, they built this enclosure around us on the shore, and what do we all think when we see it?
That's it.
That's it? It's a lot smaller than I thought it would be. I thought Plymouth Rock would be some giant Mount Rushmore thing, and it's this teeny rock, and now we've driven all the way to Plymouth, and what the hell are we going to do with our time? So the other thing you can do is go to the Living History Museum in town, which at the time, it's now called Plymouth Pawtuxet, but at the time it was called Plymouth Plantation. Who's been there? All right, we know. Okay, so this is the Living History Museum. I went there as a kid, field trip. I remembered seeing rows of these reproduced pilgrim houses. And I'm thinking, somebody there has to know about timber framing. So I get in my car, I go back to the scene of the rock, I pay for my ticket, I walk in, I go out to the grounds, just as I remembered as a kid. It's a nice, beautiful path right down to the ocean view. Two rows of these reproduced pilgrim houses, everything I remembered. And I thought, this is great. These people are going to know how to help me. But here's the thing. What do you remember about the people working out on the grounds at Plymouth Plantation?
They were 80.
Hmm?
They were 80 years old.
Well, there's that. there's that part of it. Here's where I'm going with this. They are interpreters. They are costumed interpreters. And they are given a character to play, to interpret, excuse me. I probably wouldn't like the word play. They're given a character to interpret, which is one of the passengers on
Mayflower.
And they are told, as I learned, very strictly, not to break character. So, put yourself in my shoes. I've just spent my hard-earned money. It's expensive. Tickets like $40 there. Yeah. Spent my hard-earned money. I'm on Plymouth Plantation. I'm trying to learn a little bit about timber framing. And I'm going from person to person. And they won't break character. And I am getting William Bradford's backstory. And Edward Winslow. And Mary so-and-so. And churning butter. And dipping candles. And brewing beer. And the whole thing. I'm not getting anything about how they built the darn timber frame structures. So I am getting frustrated. And I'm bouncing around like a ping pong ball, person to person. And finally, there's a woman. And she sees me from across the yard. And she gives me the wave. Psst, you, come here. Me, yeah, come here. So I walk over. And we're huddled behind one of these we're on the side of one of the buildings. And she leans down. And she's looking over her shoulder. I don't know what they do to these people if they break character. But they take this really seriously there. By the way, I have done this talk at Plymouth Plantation. And I did not cut this story out. Because it happened. She leans in. She's looking over her shoulder. She's talking in a whisper. So I start talking in a whisper. Why am I talking in a whisper? I don't know. She leans in a whisper. And she says, the person you need to talk to is named Michael Burry. He built most of these, and he knows everything. Everything. And I say, this is great. Where do I find Michael Burry? And she says, he doesn't work here anymore. He wasn't dead. She could have said he was dead. But, she gives me a number. So I pick up the phone, call Michael Burry. He answers. I look back on this, probably the most amazing part of the story. If you knew Michael, or any timber framer, preservationist, whatever, the most impressive part of the story is that I called Michael Burry and he answered on the first call. Today, miraculous. So he picks up. Michael Burry teaches at a school in Boston. Is anyone familiar with the North Bennett Street School? The oldest trade school in the country, preserving these wonderful lost arts, bookbinding, violin making. The actor Daniel Day-Lewis, since retiring, apparently went through their violin making program. And oh, by the way, they've got a program called Preservation Carpentry. And that is what Michael Burry teaches. So I track him down. He works on jobs in the summers in between. I find him on a job site. And I learn that Michael Burry is known to take on an apprentice every year. And I think, what? Leave this finance, that soul-sucking corporate crap. No offense to you in the back. It's a great industry. There's some good people in there, I swear to God. Leave that soul-sucking industry to go do wonderful preservation carpentry? What could be better? Financially, is this a good decision? No. By the way, put this into perspective. I have gone from finance to preservation to now new author.
Ouch.
Yes, my financial decisions are getting worse and worse. Thank God my wife hasn't left me yet. So, all right, a little more. Hang with me. We're getting to the end. I will shut up eventually. Don't worry. Michael takes me on as an apprentice. I spend the summer and I get in the corner of the house ready, but learning stuff from Michael. This is the thing. Are there any preservation tradespeople in here? I should ask that question too. No. All right. Then no one will be offended, because this is the thing about preservation people. We get so attached to these old buildings, and we want to save them all. It's like that person that just wants to adopt all the cats. We do that with houses. We want to save them all. Can't let any of them go. But we can't save them all. It's impossible. There's too many forces at work. So when one is going to get torn down, what does a preservation contractor do?
Cry. Take it apart.
They cry. Then what do?
Don't get it apart.
They get in their beat-up old truck, and they're all beat-up old trucks, and they drive down to the site with some tools, and they salvage as much stuff as they possibly can, because they can't let that go into the dumpster. And where do they take it? What? Home. Do they have some separate lot with warehouse buildings and storage? No! Are they all working on their homes? Yes! And they take it back to their house. And then what do they do with it? They pile it up in their attic. And what do they do when the attic's full? They pile it up in the basement. And what do they do when the attic in the basement's full? They just start piling it up on their lawn. And the piles, when you're Michael Bird and been doing this for 50 years, they go down to here, all the way up this high, over my head. And to walk around Michael Bird's property, it's like going through a maze. Falls rolling around, you don't need a corn maze. Go down to Michael's property. You'll get lost. And this is the thing. When you're the apprentice, every now and again, you need that one thing that's all the way down here in the pile that's all the way up here. And what is my job as the apprentice? Move all that stuff and get that out. And then put it all back. So I did a summer of this, all worth it, to learn those little tricks of the trade that took him decades to learn, how to cut a tenon, mortise, all that. So I finished up my summer. Final stretch of the story. Finish up the summer. It's time to get back to the Loring house. Get back to my corner in my English tying joint. So there's one thing. Richard Macy, always in the back of my mind. When Richard Macy needed wood, what did he do?
Went out into the woods and cut it.
Went out in the woods and cut the trees down. Did I think about doing that? Yes.
Of course.
Did I abandon that plan? Thank God, yes. But, for anyone that's seen these old beams, they hewed them by hand. And they used a double-beveled hewing axe in the 18th century. And when it cut, it'd leave these nice little scoops in the wood, scallop marks. And when you go to these places and the light hits it just right, it's a glorious thing, because you know what went into that. And for those of us that appreciate this stuff, they appreciate everything right down to the little scallop marks. So I cannot, in good conscience, put in a beam that has just been run through a circular saw at the local sawmill. It must have those scallop marks. So, I have a beam, here's the trick. I have a beam cut at the sawmill, but I have them make it wider. And I will hand hew that extra material off to give it the right finish. Has anyone hewn a beam before? All right, we got a couple. We got two. All right. It's a two-step process. I did not do this with Michael. I was going off an Eric Sloane book. Did anyone grow up with read the Eric Sloane books? Go to Kent, Connecticut. There's an Eric Sloane museum. It's worth a visit. Give them a little plug. There's an illustration that I'm going off of in an Eric Sloane book. It's a two-part process. My beam hewer, what do you do first?
Notch it and then cut it.
Notch it. Put them on the, sorry to put you on the spot, but that's right. So you cut a series of notches in it. Why do you do that? Because a tree's got long, stringy cellulose fibers, and if you just take a broad axe, start hacking the side of it, it can tear out and run away on you. So you sever those fibers every foot, foot and a half, And then when you come at it with the broad axe, those pieces will just pop off nice and clean in big chunks. So to do this, to cut these notches, requires, where do you stand when you cut these notches?
On top of the beam.
On top of the beam. So, I'm going to put these chairs to the test. I haven't had a chair break on me yet. So I get a brand new felling axe. Drag this beam to the far corner of the property. Liz is at work. I'm home alone one day doing this. And I climb up on said beam. And I've got my axe. And you cut these knots like little pizza notches. Do this. What is precarious about cutting notches in this fashion? You know. What happens if you miss?
Got your foot.
You cut your toes off. Do you have all your toes? You look good. You're intact. So put yourself in these shoes. I'm in my backyard. I had a vice president title at one point. And I am standing on a log with a razor sharp axe, and I'm about to swing it between my feet. Is this a good idea? No. Am I going to do it anyway? Of course I am. That's how I got a story out of this. Take some risks in life, people. So I go to lift up the axe, but then I start thinking, what happens if I do chop off a toe? I'm going to have to climb down, root around on all fours through the grass. Hopefully I can find said toe. Hopefully I can get it on ice before it turns black and like a raisin. Hopefully they can stitch it back on before the tissue's dead. These are the thoughts going through my head. But you gotta compartmentalize. Risky situation. Put that out of your mind. Gotta commit. So I take my axe and I lift it up like a medieval executioner about to chop off a head. And I bring it down with all my might. And what happens? It skips off the log and almost cuts off my toe. It didn't. Don't worry. So I get back up there and I start swinging again. This gentleman knows when you do this long enough, the mechanics just start. It's like sports, golfers, pickleball. What sports do we do? Everyone's playing the pickleball these days. Whatever thing you do, it's body mechanics. And after a while of swinging, it just starts coming naturally. So I worked this whole side, and I hewed square, and I rolled, and I worked it, and then I studied the joinery, and I cut all that, and I fit it together. You don't have to replace all the beams. You can cut little pieces in. They're called scarf joints, and I fit all these pieces in. All the rot's gone. New wood. Restore my corner, and lo and behold, the English tying joint is again intact. And I'm feeling pretty good about this. Where's my DIYers? First best part of a project is starting it. Second best part, especially when you get yourself in a hole, finishing it. Isn't it amazing? You are basking in the glow of self-accomplishment. And this is where I'm at. The story's almost done. And I'm feeling good. And I go to the bathroom. I'm cleaning myself up. I'm covered, dust and dirt and the whole sawdust and the whole thing. And I'm washing my hands and the water is running off and brown down the sink. I'm getting the stuff off my face. And I'm looking the stuff on my face in the mirror. And I'm leaning in, make sure I got it all. And what happens to the reflection in the mirror as you get closer to it? It gets bigger. You see more of the room behind you. And I'm leaning in. And in the reflection behind me, I see a big black spot on the ceiling that I don't remember seeing when we walked through this house. And I'm thinking, what the hell is that? That, ladies and gentlemen, is this on? No. It's the end of chapter 1. So, it was mold, by the way. You're right. So this is the story. It's not about Pembroke. It's not about the old stodgy English guy that had the house built. Probably didn't build it himself anyway. A lot of these local histories, that's what people focus on because we get attached to our towns, and I get that, and that's fine. But that is not this story. The protagonist of this book is the house itself. And every chapter is based on one of 6 materials used to build a house of this period: wood, lime, stone, iron, glass, and brick. And each chapter follows in the same structure. I get into it. I'm trying to be Richard Macy, using traditional tools and techniques. I think I can do it all myself. Quickly get myself in a hole. Have to go off and find someone to help me out of this mess. All the traditional builders are wonderful for characters. They're all eccentric. Just as I'm getting myself out of this, things are looking good. Something else goes wrong, and it leads you into the next chapter. And all of this is happening. The clock is ticking on an 18-month timeline. Will I get to Thanksgiving? Will I fail in my quest? I cannot tell you that. You have to read the book. So, my closing comments. I opened up this little talk by telling you why I wrote this book. Why did I write this book? What did I say? Have we forgotten already? It hasn't been that long. To create... What did he say at the beginning? I don't know. From Vermont. He was from Vermont. I remember that part.
Spread the word.
To create more advocacy for historic preservation. Yes! I am doing am I preaching to the choir? Do we all want to save the old buildings that create the wonderful charm in our towns? Of course we do. I am doing everything in my power to do this. We are getting some traction. Because I didn't make this local history, it's got more room to grow. We have been in the Boston Globe, the New York Times. We have an upcoming piece in Yankee Magazine. We are a finalist for the New England Book Award. And I am traveling everywhere I can go to get this story out there to create more advocacy for historic preservation. But I cannot do it alone. What do I need? Money. Your help. That's good. I need your help. What is the best way you can help me? Buy the book. This is where I put my sales hat on, people. See, the finance guy's still in there. Still in there. Listen. If you don't like it, it won't hurt my feelings. Flip it open, go to one of the pages, and then tear it out and crumple it up and stuff it in that drafty window. Tear it out, crumple it up. Winter's coming, fall season's rolling around. Put it on that old hearth and start your fire with it. I don't care what you do with it once you bought it. Wobbly table, rolling floors, stuff it under the table leg. It's a great prop. I don't care what you do with it. But if you do like it, help me spread the word. Share it with somebody. Write a review. Buy it as a gift. I don't care. Help me spread the word. I cannot do this alone. The more people interested in this, the fewer of these contentious battles we have to save the next building. The more people that are interested in this, the more funding we get. The more funding we get, the more buildings we save. That is my story. The book is The House Restored. I am Lee McColgan. Thank you for your time. Do we have any questions?
Didn't Michael Burry have a beam you could use in your house instead of having to make your own?
Okay, so my early thought of this was to salvage old beams. And everyone's got their own philosophy to this stuff. But the preservationists, at least the ones that I work around, so they actually are in favor of using new wood, because there was a big colonial revival in the early 20s. People were restoring these things, and they were salvaging all this old stuff, putting this stuff together, and then architectural historians come along later, and they're trying to date this stuff and figure this stuff out, and sometimes these houses are just a mishmash. So they're actually in favor of using new wood and dating it and marking it and doing all that stuff, on the beams, chiseling your date and all that in there. And that's the approach most of them use. Yeah. So I followed in those footsteps.
I don't think you mentioned if you cured the green wood before you installed it.
Okay, this is a fantastic question. So they would cut these things. It's really easy to hew the beam when it's got a lot of moisture in it. So I always say it's like a steak. So when you overcook a steak, the cells dry up and it's like shoe leather trying to cut into it. When it's got a lot of moisture in it, it cuts easy, you can chew it. So wood is the same way. So wood is made of cellulose and lignin, and when those long longitudinal cells are saturated with water, they cut apart, break apart nice and easy, and when they dry down, they're hard as a rock, and they're much harder to work with hand tools. So back in the day, they would use green wood for all these things. The problem with green wood is it shrinks and moves. So in this particular case, I was lucky to put green wood against older wood that was not in relatively high moisture content, and I got a little bit of movement. Some of those joints opened up a little wider that were fit perfectly, but for the most part, it stayed respectable. But yeah, that can be a big problem. The worst thing, yeah, there's a section in the book about that. I actually was doing a little tinkering with timber framing before I met Michael and went down this rabbit hole before we bought the house, and was playing around with is it Ted Benson? Does anyone know who Ted Benson is? Yeah, Jack Sobin and Ted Benson, I think, get most of the credit for the timber frame revival, and it's largely because they're the ones that have written most widely about it. So I had tinkered around with a Ted Benson book. Wonderful man. I've talked to him. I've never met him, but he's been kind enough to take phone calls from me and chat with me for a bit. So I was tinkering around with a Ted Benson book and cut and joinery, and I had a sawyer that didn't understand how to source the wood. You want centered pith, and you got to look for twists in the grain and all these things. So they were just cutting me beams, and I was cutting all this joinery in that, and half of that stuff just twisted, bowed, moved, and that's frustrating. Although, literally, just over the weekend, I was in Salem, Massachusetts, and there's a house. It's a 17th century. It gets credited as, they call it, the witch house. It was the judge, Corwin, I forget his first name, but one of the judges on the Salem witch trials, and the house he lived in still stands. And I was just on a tour through that one. I just took a picture of this. There was a floor joist on the second story, and this thing was like a hockey stick. So my question was, did that just bend that way after they put this, or were they just at a point where we're going to lat the plaster on the ceiling, so who cares, no one's going to see it? But this thing was like, and that period you don't see too much of that stuff, but you see that every now and again. But green wood didn't cause me too many major problems. Yeah. Good question, though. Hit me. The woodworker.
Yeah, two questions.
Oh, boy.
Have you bought a pair of steel-toed boots yet?
Okay.
And two, is your wife the one who gets the job with health insurance?
Okay. The two answers are, from the day that I apprenticed with Michael, the first thing he said to me was, buy steel-toed boots. And I've ignored him for 8 years, and knock on wood, have not had a timber crush my toes and have not lopped off a toe doing this. Some of his students, when they do the hewing stuff, they'll wear hockey knee pads. I see that every now and again. I just do a little bit of timber framing repair, so I didn't get into it. I'm a full-time timber framer. I became kind of an old house handyman that does a little bit of all of it. So I've gotten away without steel-toed boots. And then, yes, my wife. There are two questions I usually get about her is, are you still married? Yes. Why does she put up with this? Her father loved old houses, so I think she had an appreciation for it. And she's working, and I'm on her insurance at the moment. So, thank you, Liz. Liz, if you hear me, thank you. I couldn't do any of this without you. She's been great.
So what do you think about the mixture of kind of more modern techniques and materials and things like that, if you do it in a way that's still in keeping with the house? I mean, in other words, how primitive does it have to be? Okay, so there's two. First off, I'm not recommending that you all go. I understand that this is insane. That's fine. I'm not saying this is how we need to go back to building houses this way. I'm just saying, let's just not bulldoze them all, and let's try to keep some of that stuff intact. So I think I have two thoughts to that. One would be, there's the aesthetic element of that, and my philosophy is actually a little different. So when you get into kitchens and bathrooms, I see people that try to do modern kitchens and bathrooms and make it look period, but then it just ends up looking kind of tacky. I'm actually a fan. We did some cosmetic work on the bathroom. I like the contrast of ultra modern and really old. So I did a bathroom where everything was reversible. Everything I put in could be taken out. All the original building fabric was preserved. We put shower liners and the shower system that you put in there over the horsehair plaster, all intact. All could be taken out, ultra modern.
But then did little fun things like there's someone that makes reproduction Delft tiles in Holland, and you get tiles. So I did put stuff like that in there. The toilet bowl we used in there. On the tank lid, there's a molding profile that looks similar to 18th century the profiles they like to use. So I would do little stuff like that to kind of tie it in, but ultra modern features. Structurally, it's a different story. And again, there are many times where this kind of way of doing things is just not practical. There are actually times, though, where mixing new and old can become very problematic. One of the big ones I've seen is masonry. So one of the big problems you get is you've got these old stone, or old stone's not as big of an issue, brick. So if you look at brick stacks, and they're out in the weather, and they were wood-fired to begin with and stove kiln, so the brick's fairly soft compared to modern brick as it is, and it's been sitting out in the rain for 200-300 years, so it's fairly weak. But the mortar is even softer. So it's made of seashells, calcium carbonate, is fired 800 to 1800 degrees, somewhere in there, and converted into a putty, and they mix sand and horsehair, and they use that for mortar. Most of the failure doesn't happen from compression. So there's this impression that, we need hard mortar. Don't use the old mortar because it's soft. They used it for hundreds of years and it was fine. The bigger problem I see is when someone comes and repoints a chimney or a brick building and they use modern day Portland cement. So it's very hard and it's not super permeable, where the old mortar is softer and much more permeable. And what ends up happening is two things. So one, if things are settling and moving, you want your mortar to fail first. You don't want your mortar to be rock hard and start cracking your brick. The other big problem you get is all these materials are permeable, so when it rains, it soaks up water, and then the sun comes out and the water evaporates back out. The big problem I see is when the water starts getting trapped. So when people start using moisture barriers and modern methods on permeable materials, they end up trapping moisture and sometimes can do more damage. So with bricks, I see that a lot where someone repoints with Portland cement. The old soft brick soaks up all the water when it rains. It doesn't wick back out through the mortar, and then especially around the time when the seasons change, you get the frost heave cycles, and bricks start to spall because the moisture's trapped when it freezes and breaks off. And same thing with the house wraps and all that stuff. Those are supposedly permeable, but if you're going to use the modern methods, you want to seal your base. You can't have any moisture getting in. The problem is people are using latex paints and they're sealing these things up, but moisture's coming up from the basement or other places, and now you're just trapping it and accelerating rot. So mixing, that's a long-winded answer, but mixing old and new structurally, there are some issues where I wouldn't do it.
So there's a sequel to be written that tells us those kind of things.
Maybe. Perhaps. Yeah, there's a good book. It's actually, I forget the name of the author, but an English author. It's called the Old House Handbook. And then there's an Old House Eco Handbook. Those two books have been fantastic for me. Because the other thing, you can kind of debate the energy efficiency, environmental sustainability under this. So my kind of at face value case is, a timber frame structure, the oldest standing timber frame structure in the country is in Dedham, Massachusetts, built in 1637. It's called the Fairbanks House. The oldest standing timber frame structure in the world is built in the 7th century. It's in Tibet. It's a very durable way to build, assuming your house doesn't burn down or rot away. So my argument, so it's like, well, now we're building stuff with 2x6s and it's pine and it's not going to last, and we're just nailing it together. It's not going to last as long. What's the point of building something to last a long time? Well, the materials that we use to build it will have time to replace themselves. So you can make a sustainability case there. Where you can't make a great sustainability case is, well, I want to save the old windows because I think it gives it character, but in the winter all the heat's just going right out. So there's always that debate of, well, you got to replace those. The Old House Eco Handbook has kind of ways to think about energy efficiency without just throwing everything in the dumpster. But fortunately there's not a perfect solution to that one. So I have become like Michael when people take the windows out to put in the Andersons or the Pellas. I'm the one that now pulls over and loads them in the back of my car. My pile is growing. It's not like his, but it's growing. Yeah.
Can I ask one more?
Go ahead.
How does that translate when you're doing, historic preservation like the Alcott House, when it's not like for yourself or for a friend or something, where
Okay.
you get like a whole public being potentially suspicious and having opinions?
Okay. This is one of the biggest learning lessons for me, having my own kind of idealistic philosophies on this and then going out and doing it as business and working for clients. So my goal was to just work with museums. I didn't want to do a lot of residential stuff because at least the museum properties, they've been around preservation for a long time. The stewards of these buildings here kind of understand what goes into all this. And the conversations are much smoother. So and that's worked for me. I've largely just worked. I very rarely do residential stuff, which has been nice. The one thing that I got wrong is that I thought that everyone that oversaw an old house museum would be thinking like this. And I realized a lot of them don't. A lot of people oversee house museums that don't know or care about any of this. Like everyone else that owns a house, they want it done cheap and fast, and they want it to look nice. And some of them don't even want to hear what you're, obviously I talk a lot, so I'm the one that wants to explain, well, we're going to do this and this, and this is why. And some people love that and they want to learn, and other people are like, yeah, I don't care about that. Just get it done and send me a bill and then get out of my hair. So yeah, I've realized that you're basically every project you get into, especially this client project, you're kind of picking your own battles, and there's sometimes town politics, and you open up a can of worms a bit. But so I kind of take everything is case by case, and I kind of read. I've gotten better at reading who's running the job and who's paying for it, and do they see it the way I see it, and then I work with those people, and people that are in a different ballpark, I just avoid them. Yeah, but every project it's case by case. Yeah.
Well, my house is only 50 years old.
All right.
What can I take from the book?
So that's a broad question. So I would say just because it's 50 years old doesn't mean there aren't traditional permeable materials. So like, is the siding wood, or is the siding aluminum or vinyl, or I don't know what the siding is. But
wood, yeah.
It's wood sided. So there are things the one material I didn't get into is permeable paints. So we've really shifted to latex. It's getting harder to find oil-based anything. But oil-based paints soak into the substrate, and the problem with latex is essentially you're putting a sheet of rubber over permeable material, and that's fine when it's brand new and it keeps the water out, but when it starts to fail and water starts getting in, that's when you start seeing it bubbling. And I poked on latex paint after a rainstorm where it's getting in, and it's now just filled up like water. There's a little blister of water, and you're literally just trapping water against your wood siding. So, I mean, I thought about doing a chapter on paints. I didn't get into that, but even a modern house, if it's vinyl siding, that's a different story, but what kind of paint do you use? Do you go with an oil-based paint? Do you use the latex paint? I played around with different finishes and stuff like that. There are ways where kind of understanding these concepts can still be applicable to modern building. I don't know if that's really answering the question, but
I was more asking if I need to buy a new house.
Oh, listen, I did not grow up in a really old house, and someone gave me a book written by, who was Spinea? Oh, Sarah, you said Spinea. Your parents were involved with Spinea. So there's a very well-known historian named Abbott Lowell Cummings, and he wrote a book. This is specific to Massachusetts, but it's called The Framed Houses of Massachusetts Bay, 1625, 1725. And it's just a big picture book. It's not only pictures, but it highlights a lot of the really early surviving houses, and most of them are museums. And I didn't grow up in an old house. Someone gave me this book, and I just started poking around these things and crawling around at it. And by the end of a few years of that, I'm like, I need to own one. Like, this is what I have to do. I try to make a connection as to why, having not grown up in an old house. To me, it comes back to growing up in Vermont and going out with friends in the woods and the mountains and building lean-tos and damming up streams, and you're kind of using these minimally processed materials. I just love that, and really I've been doing that as an extension of my childhood stuff. I'm not a psychologist, but there's probably something there, so I tie into that. But yeah, maybe the answer for you is, yeah, you gotta sell that thing. Go buy an old one. Get into it. You'll have your own. You could do your own book. You won't make any money. It's probably not going to be a breakout, but good luck. Yeah.
How do you insulate an old house?
Okay, so there is, so ours is done, which they just blew a bunch of insulation in there. They did. I had thoughts of, do I get a big vacuum and start to suck all that out? And because it's back to the permeability issue. It's insulation-wise, it's good. It keeps it much warmer than the winter than if it wasn't in there. The issue, though, back to the permeability issue. We get when it gets clammy, a lot of moisture in that house. And I do worry that stuff is molding and getting. Some of it I think is just the paper, cellulose fiber insulation stuff. I'm like, is that creating a mold problem up there? I don't know. I don't even want to tear it open or get into that. There is a belief that all of these really early houses didn't have any insulation, which is not true. So what they used to do, so back to bricks being fired in a stove kiln, so they didn't have the temperature control that we have when we fire stuff today. So they're literally someone manning the stove kiln would be like opening up little hatches all around the kiln to try to let air in different places to regulate the temperature. But even the best of them, bricks would be fired inconsistently. So you'd have some bricks that are fired. It's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Some were fired perfectly. Some were overfired, they black and twisted, and some were underfired. They called them salmon bricks because they were like salmon in color. And they would just be, you wouldn't use that on a chimney stack because they'd deteriorate much faster. So they would take them and they would line them in between the frame, and that's called nogging. And they would use that, and then they would lath and plaster over that. I've not torn open any of the exterior walls in our house, so I'm actually not even, now you say that, I'm not even sure if there's nogging in there. I don't think there is, but they blew insulation in the ceiling in the attic because most of the heat's going out, and I've just left that alone.
They mean previous
owners, yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, comment, then a question.
Nope, only questions. No, just kidding. For a finance guy, of course.
Yeah, Fine Home Building is great articles, and like there's one by Josh Salinger just a couple months ago. We've got it in Portland where it rains all the time. He talks about all the different kinds of modern materials you can use to wrap the houses, and there's all different kinds of materials. And he talks all about moisture control and how you can deal with the moisture control issue, because it's the #1 problem in Portland and Seattle area.
Mm-hmm.
Houses not decaying, in 10 years and having black mold everywhere.
Yep.
And it can also have to be teamed with the right HVAC systems. You can deal with a lot of that moisture control with HVAC instead of the old building materials that are permeable. So in an old building, you got to do all that figuring out, which is the right combination.
Yeah. So Sobin and Ted Benson had two different. Jack Sobin was more like this. He just wants to how they do it back then, and let's just copy that. And Ted Benson was a bigger believer of what can we use the traditional ways that really improves, and then how can we take modern technology and make things even better. And he's a big fan, from what I know, of using SIP panels. So it's structured insulated panel. It's basically 2 sheets of plywood with a piece of foam in the middle. But he'll build a timber frame, and instead of just putting sheeting on the outside and then plaster and the insulating in between the beams, and a lot of people are doing this now, they build a timber frame and then they just, instead of sheeting boards, they just put these big insulated panels on. And that's a way to do it, and that seems to be fairly popular. But I do a smidge of timber framing. I'm not doing new build timber frames all the time, so those people know a lot more about it than I do. One more? Do you have one more?
Oh, no, actually I just was coming up with a comment, which is about old buildings, and I think why people find them so appealing, which has to do with symmetry and the way that people built hundreds of years ago, right up until maybe 80 years ago, is they had certain standards for where the doors and windows and the shape of the house, and those standards were very well known.
Yes.
So Joe Schmo could build himself a house and just sort of ask his buddy Fred Schmo or whoever. And they
Joe and Fred Schmo. Those are my brothers. Don't talk bad about my brothers, Joe and Fred Schmo.
This is good. No, I'm kidding. It's a helpful expert.
It's the dumbest thing I've said in weeks.
This is 3 to 1 over here, and it's 2 to 1 over here, and this will therefore make a graceful appearance.
Yeah.
And that was very common knowledge, and it's got all to hell in the last 80 years.
Okay, so there's a guy named Jonathan Hale. I've never met him, but he wrote a book called The Old Way of Seeing. And he delves into, it starts to stray away from science. You get into the golden ratio stuff. Architects are big believers, and there's pseudoscience and all that.
Pattern line?
Yeah, but so I agree, the whole regulating line concept. So I do look at once I learned that, I started seeing it everywhere. It's like, you can kind of connect. There is some thoughtful symmetry to how the fenestration of the building is laid out. And to your point, not everyone has lost that. When architects build stuff, they get all that stuff. But modern, residential housing, and you don't have, architects that are going to really great schools that are building regular housing. You get developers and contractors that they're just thinking a lot of times functionally. So we'll put the dormer there, and put this thing here and this thing there, and it'll create this nice entryway. And to your point, at the end of it, it's just a mishmash. So on the window chapter, I dive into that whole thing. Yeah. I love it. All right, we're going along. Let's pull the plug on this. We good? All right, I'm done. Thank you.